Governor Chris Sununu's rollback of the statewide mask mandate and announcement that all business restrictions will lift by May 7th drew very different responses across the partisan divide. Most Democrats contend it was too soon. Many Republicans applauded the move. Here this morning to discuss, State Senator Tom Sherman, a doctor practicing on the Seacoast, and Representative Robert Lynn, the former Chief Justice of the New Hampshire Supreme Court, coming at this from two very different but very important perspectives. Thank you for joining us this morning, gentlemen. And let's start with you, Senator Sherman. Why do you disagree with the governor's decision?
Well, thank you, Adam. My last 30 years in practice as a doctor, many of which were in New Hampshire, have allowed me to always hold patients first. And as a senator and as a state rep before that, I did the same for constituents. So this is no different. The single most important aspect of any policy that has to do with COVID is to make sure we don't have anybody get sick unnecessarily or die unnecessarily. And we know that wearing a mask helps. We know that from a lot of different sources. So the idea of allowing the mask mandate to lapse right now, when our statewide levels are at what was the same as the post-Thanksgiving surge, when we had seen last week a 12% rise over the week before in case counts. Our hospitals have over 120 patients in them. This is absolutely the wrong time to be relaxing our standards and dropping our guard. We need to keep this up right now for at least another month until we can see those numbers consistently falling.
Representative Lynn, how about you? Why do you think the governor made the right move here?
Yeah, I think to me, the governor did make a very reasonable decision here. And I have to say, that if you look back at the governor's actions throughout the course of this pandemic, he has gotten flack from both sides and has had to sort of wade through a variety of considerations all the way through. And I think while you might quibble with one or two things along the way, I think in general he's done an excellent job of managing the pandemic. And I think the public by their reelection of him last year certainly endorsed that. But with respect to my colleague Senator Sherman, I think I completely understand where he's coming from a medical perspective. But that's why it seems to me that under the law, it's not, the medical perspective is not the only perspective to be considered. You have to consider the sort of the economic perspective, the perspective of what kind of infringement on liberty does the mask impose. And I understand that there are certainly circumstances in which that infringement on liberty is acceptable. But I think that given the current circumstances here, with the vaccination rollout being very successful, I think probably the most successful in the country, that the governor made a reasonable choice. And he's, by the way, as he said, he is not saying that people shouldn't wear masks. He actually encouraged people to wear masks in situations where it seems appropriate, but he just felt at the time to mandate that we've kind of gotten beyond that. And I think that was a reasonable choice.
Senator Sherman, what do you make of the civil liberties argument there? How do you respond to that?
Well, we allow people to drink really as much as they want in their homes, but the minute they hit the road, they had better not have been drinking. Same thing is with this. We know that somebody who's driving drunk is dangerous for others. They represent a threat to others. Somebody who doesn't want to wear a mask at home, that's fine. But if they're not vaccinated, and even if they are vaccinated, if they are out in public, not socially distanced, and don't wear a mask, they're putting others at risk, as well as themselves. So the fact that they are doing that is really what allows us in the setting of a pandemic to say, no, that's not okay, just like driving a car while drunk isn't okay. So on a civil liberties standpoint, I don't think this holds any water. And there were a couple of other things that Justice Lynn said that are really important, and I agree with him. I think we have done a good job up until now. And that's really important. I also think that this is the exact wrong time to be dropping our guard as we move into the single most important season for the state's economy, which is the summer. Whether you're up in the North Country, in the Lakes region, or down here on the seacoast, there is nothing more important than being able to fully reopen New Hampshire. And to put that at risk with this premature lifting of the mask mandate is, in my view, really inconsistent with healthcare policy.
Justice Lynn, what's your response there? Isn't there a wider community responsibility here that perhaps the mask mandate would help with, at least on the pandemic side, for a little while longer?
You know, I think that I guess I don't buy the analogy that Senator Sherman has drawn between the drunk driving and this situation, because I think that the evidence, and he's the doctor. I don't profess in any sense to be an expert in medicine by a long shot. But I have followed this, I think, relatively closely, and I think that the evidence regarding exactly how efficient the masks are and in what circumstances, I think, is subject to some debate. For example, I can recall hearing from Dr. Walensky, I think the new head of CDC, that once you've been vaccinated, you're not a spreader anymore. But then I heard from Dr. Fauci that maybe that's not true. So I think that this isn't at all a situation that's as clear as the drunk driving situation. So I think that, I'm sorry.
No, Senator Sherman, though, what about the business side of this? Those restrictions are going to lapse as well. Is that a mistake?
The key to reopening our businesses is keeping people safe. That's where this comes from. There is absolutely, I hate to correct the justice, but there is incredibly strong evidence both on the business side and on the public health side that masking makes a difference. Even the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston did a study and a report that was published back in December that showed that we would have had, with a nationwide mask mandate, a 74% reduction in the rate of infections across the country. That's critical. So there's a lot of scientific evidence, which I won't go into today, that would support that. But when you look at reopening the economy, I do agree with the governor. We all want to fully reopen the economy. But whether you're a business that has employees who you say you have to wear masks, or customers where the business says you have to wear masks, think of the shift in the anger of people who don't want to wear masks when they walk into a business and the governor no longer says they need to wear a mask. Well, I'm sorry, the governor said I don't need to wear a mask, so I'm not wearing a mask in your business. The mandate is gone. That's putting an awful heavy burden on the businesses. And it's also when people are exposing both the employees and other customers to their when they're breathing and they're exposing them, that also is a heavy burden to not only those businesses, but to the ability of us to reopen as an economy. It's interesting because that study from the Boston Federal Reserve Bank showed that not only do we see a decreased risk of infection, but we see increased mobility. That means people are moving, they're out in public, they're freer to move when there is a mask mandate.
Senator,
so
we're going to stop you there and give Justice Lynn a chance to respond as we have about 90 seconds left. Justice Lynn, wrap things up there. How do you respond?
Sure.
To that?
I would be, first of all, as I say, that there's nothing in the governor's order, and I'm not sure that I really buy the idea that, that because there's no mask mandate, that in situations where people should wear masks, most of them are not going to, or even, a very significant percentage of them are not going to. I'm not sure that, I guess I sort of trust our citizens. And I think that's part of, kind of where I have maybe more, I place more emphasis on the liberty part of this. I kind of trust our citizens to do the right thing when in circumstances where they should, whether there's a mandate or not. And I think that that there are, as I said, from what the things that I've read, and I don't profess to be a doctor, there are many questions about exactly how efficient or how helpful wearing masks are. I don't doubt that they are helpful. to some extent. But how helpful and in what circumstances? I think those things are subject to legitimate question.
And we could keep debating this for a while, but we've hit our time. Representative Lynn and Senator Sherman, thank you so much for joining us today on Close Up.
Thank you, guys.